Okay, hello everyone. Hi, I'm Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Great to see everyone. This is part of the MedTech Innovator live webinar series that we do every week at the same time, 10:30 Pacific time on Thursdays as part of the MedTech Innovator Accelerator program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with MedTech Innovator, we are the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world. We focus on medical devices, diagnostics, and digital health technologies. And this series is designed to give the companies in our annual cohort an opportunity to speak with panelists who are experts in a particular topic. In this case, today, we're going to be talking about sales and market access. And one of the important things is that the companies that are part of the accelerator cohort are here live as well. They're in the attendees right now here on the Zoom webinar. At the end of the hour, they'll be able to ask questions live and have some Q&A. So between now and then, we're going to spend an hour talking with experts about market access and sales. And while we're doing that, you have the opportunity, if you're here on YouTube Live, to submit some questions via the YouTube Live chat, which is on the right-hand side of the page. I'll be monitoring that. I'll try to get to those questions during the live public broadcast. If we don't get to them, I'll try and even answer those in the chat as well. So that's the setup for the companies that are here on the webinar. As always, just use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom and you can queue up your questions for the Q&A session. So that's the background. I'm really excited about today's discussion because frankly, besides developing your product, market access is pretty much the most important thing that you'll be doing as a company. And I have some really great panelists who've joined us today. So I'm very excited. I'm going to introduce each of them and they'll tell you a little bit about their companies, themselves, their work in market access. So I'm going to start off first with Dave Uffer, who's a partner at Alira Health. Dave.
Thank you, Paul. I'm Dave Uffer, senior partner at Alira Health. I'm a 30-year veteran of the medtech industry, having experience in Abbott Laboratories, Boston Scientific, Hologic, and most recently Covidien and Medtronic. At Alira Health, we are a global advisory where we assist clients in advisory through medical affairs, both clinical and regulatory, strategy consulting and corporate development, as well as downstream in market access, health economics, and go-to-market strategies. And finally, we are investment bankers leading transactions for those companies.
Terrific firm. We love working with Alira Health. We love working with you, Dave, in particular, but everyone at Alira. A lot of the companies in MedTech Innovator have the benefit of working directly with you and the other members of the team there. So we hear terrific things all the time. So great to be working with you. Next up, Laurel Sweeney, principal at Access Strategies. Laurel.
Hi, thanks, and welcome everybody. Just a little bit about myself. I was with Philips for many, many years. I spent time as a lobbyist, and then I ran and built their global market access and health economics group. And I left a couple years ago and started my own consulting business and have spent time doing, I think, what I'm passionate about, and that's really figuring out how to shape a value proposition and bring some of the new innovations to market, particularly focused on digital health, telehealth, and a lot of the AI applications, devices that can really change the way healthcare is delivered today. And as part of that, I also represent industry on the AMA's Digital Medicine Advisory Group. And just for fun, I'm a trustee at a hospital, so I kind of get the real sort of scoop on what's actually happening out there. So thanks.
That is fun. I'm glad you get to do that. Yeah. An amazing background, and our companies have had the benefit of working with you as well, Laurel, as part of our value workshop this year, and we're looking forward to having that continue as well. So thank you, Laurel. Next up, Amy Siegel, co-founder of S2N Health. Oh, you're muted, Amy. Amy, if you can hear me, you're muted.
Sorry, yep, sorry about that. I knew I would do that. I'd be the first. Amy Siegel, S2N Health is my firm. We're based in Boston, normally downtown, now spread out. And we help innovators in medical technology with market and business strategy. So like part of your team, your commercial team, when you're trying to raise money, when you're trying to decide what your product is, how to launch, we work very closely with innovators. And also some people buying innovation as well. So we get a nice seat at the buy and the sell table. And I'm excited to be here. I know this most people on this panel quite well. So it's an honor to be here.
Great, thank you. Amy, it's an honor to have you here as well. Again, many of our companies have worked with you and have reported wonderful things, so thank you for that. Next up, Brian Vaughn, VP of Health Economics and Market Access for Johnson & Johnson. Brian.
Well, thanks, and welcome everybody. Thrilled to have the opportunity to be with you all today. So Brian Vaughn, I lead franchise health economics and market access at Ethicon. Ethicon is one of the J&J family of medical tech companies. We're focused specifically in the areas of surgical devices. We're about a $9 billion business, and the team that I lead is responsible for end-to-end strategies. So throughout the life cycle for all of our platforms, from early innovation through optimization when products are late life cycle, thinking about how we can make sure that we have planned strategies that are aimed at getting our technologies into the hands of surgeons so they can help patients. So that means we go from early innovation through launch planning and through the optimization phase, which is where we look for new markets and new claims and new opportunities to grow. So it's a topic I'm passionate about and look forward to the time today.
Thanks, Brian. So, it's interesting. Something you just said there, Brian, is really important. And that's, you said you start with at the early innovation stages all the way through, obviously supporting market access and then, beyond. And so maybe I'm just going to start off with this as a question then is kind of, how we've seen, a change in how, we think about value and we think about market access at companies large and small. And particularly, I know in the past, a lot of people have said, they focus on reimbursement codes. Everyone's like, okay, I'm just going to quickly check and see if there's a code for this product and, that I want to develop. And they kind of see that as, okay, I've solved my market access as a code that maybe I can squeeze in. So I obviously with Laurel laughing, that's not the case. So Laurel, maybe I'll start off with you and tell us, how you've seen a shift in how the thinking is and where we should be thinking.
Certainly. And I think it can start out with saying, when I first started doing this, my title was reimbursement because we were focused on coding, coverage, payment, the traditional fee-for-service reimbursement pathway. But as the market started to shift away from necessarily fee-for-service, talking about value-based payments, and as finances and costs became a bigger issue, payers were getting a little more concerned about just covering technologies with no real evidence of value. And so we've really expanded the role, I think, beyond just reimbursement. I like to think of it in terms of the risk to market adoption that we really address. So starting with the value proposition, what's the clinical problem you're trying to solve? Is it a problem that's big enough for people to want to spend money on? Is it relevant in the market you're in? All of those sort of questions need to be answered as sort of a first step. The other part is really what's the payment pathway? It could be direct reimbursement. There could be a code involved. There could be a need for coverage policies. But many times, certainly with the digital technologies I work with, those clear reimbursement pathways aren't there. So we have to think about, who's the financial stakeholder here? What kind of evidence are they going to require? The second thing is really looking at the evidence requirements in your evidence plans. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Is there a return on investment for the evidence that you're going to have to develop? Is it relevant? Is it going to resonate with the financial stakeholder? And then finally, the policy issues. I mentioned that I was a lobbyist to start with, and really how I got into reimbursement was, lots of legislation around imaging, which was one of Philips' big product lines, and how it impacted payment for imaging. So suddenly all the capital equipment companies that really didn't think about reimbursement before was like, that's really impacting our market, so we have to pay attention to this. And so I think that's the sort of the four ways that I would define market access now.
Thank you very much, Laurel. Anyone else want to add on to that? And for all of you, for our panelists, at any time, if you want to add an additional thought or something, you can always kind of raise your hand and I'll call on you. So
I think Laurel's description really kind of covers a major theme that I think we've identified, and that is that it's market access really is an outcome. We view it more as an outcome now, more than maybe a function, because it's truly a team sport. What we realize now is that for us to get market access right, it starts with making sure that we have the right product that's solving the right problem. That's something that happens through close work with R&D. It has everything to do with our relationship with our commercial organizations and how we actually plan to sell the product in the markets that we want to go to. So, in similar fashion, my title when I first started over 20 years ago in this space was reimbursement. And I think those of us who had reimbursement experience got those jobs because nobody else knew how to do it. But now I think what's key is market access has become part of our strategy from early on. And again, not just the innovation strategy, but our overall business strategy. And I think that's a major change. It's been evolution, not revolution in the medical device, but I seriously believe that we realize that beyond just having the right technology, access for that technology is the goal.
And access, not just here in the US, but worldwide, right, as well?
Correct. In the markets where it can make the most difference.
Yeah. So that's a lot, and it's a lot for people to think about and understand. And I know it's pretty complicated. Obviously, small companies aren't going to have a full market access team and worldwide spread out. Just give me just a little bit of a sense of what's the scale of that at a company like Johnson & Johnson?
The scale of our focus on HEMA?
No, I'm saying your team, like how many people are part of the market access?
Of course. So again, evolution, not revolution. But if I look across medical device, we each of the franchise organizations at Johnson & Johnson Medical Device have franchise teams that ladder up to what we call a center of excellence for health economics and market access. It's a global team. So we have 3 franchise teams and then 3 regional teams, and that's about 150 people in total focused on market access for medical devices at J&J.
That's amazing. I'm extremely jealous now. I'm sure.
And I think the trick with that, just to add, is that it includes kind of the in-house work to get things right from a strategy standpoint. And it also includes kind of the pointy end folks that are meeting with payers, customers to bring that value proposition, to have the arguments we need to have with payers about reimbursement, policymakers, et cetera. So it includes both.
That's terrific. It's really impressive, and it certainly speaks to the importance of market access, and as an organization that everyone who's listening to this webinar, you've got to be thinking about this stuff from the beginning. We'll get into details on that in a little bit. Amy, let me go to you for a minute to talk a little bit about some of the added challenges now in terms of strategy, evidence, et cetera, that innovators need to be thinking about at early stages. What are some of the things that you're advising?
Right. I mean, you used to worry about technology risk. You used to worry about regulatory risk. Now it's all market and payment risk. And you really have to start de-risking those things right away. And it starts with showing that somebody will care about the problem that you're solving. And I know Laurel will love that I mentioned that. But that you're solving a problem that is big enough to matter and have an impact, where somebody might be willing to pay, let's say, more for an innovative technology. Or that maybe you're a cost disruptor and you can truly show that you bend the cost curve and you improve care. That's the goal. But really thinking through that so early on that it becomes existential in knowing whether or not you actually have a business. So I think it begins as early as concept, to say, what problem am I solving? Is it a big enough problem? Who are the stakeholders? And will they pay enough? And if you don't have at least a strong hypothesis there, you may not have a company or product.
Thanks, Amy. So Dave, kind of tactically, how do you do this? When you start working with some of these small companies at an early stage to think about these things, how do you do these things tactically?
As Amy was mentioning, it's existential. We start with the business plan first and foremost, and we have to be focused on the business plan, and then market access has to support that. When we look at particular ends of market access, such as health economics, that's been another evolution, as Brian mentioned. Years ago, we were asked to come and do health economic studies when people had already had approval and had launched and were not getting the uptake of their technology. And we started pushing these much earlier into the clinical trials and getting secondary endpoints incorporated into the trials to actually have the data, or you really don't have a health economic argument that you could actually demonstrate with good data. And now, as Brian was mentioning, We've been at AdvaMed in every type of seminar and webinar like these, trying to push the thematic development of R&D. When you're at the R&D stage is when you need to start thinking about health economics and the value proposition that you're creating, just not in a competitive, my device or technology is better than the other competitors, but what is the actual health economic benefit that you're going to derive, and actually build that into your R&D and product design.
Great, thanks, Dave. Super helpful. And Laurel, yeah.
I just wanted to add just something regarding sort of new things that have come to light with these new sort of digital technologies in telehealth. And that's not only just evidence that it works and that you're improving outcomes, but there's the issue of, can I trust the data? And that's a big issue, especially when you think about AI algorithms. You know, do I believe what this algorithm is saying to me? Am I going to make a clinical decision based on it? And with telehealth, also, it's patient acceptance and trust, because one of the issues is we've had some remote monitoring codes, we've had telehealth reimbursement. The adoption before the pandemic wasn't very high. And part of the reason was sort of patient resistance around telehealth. And so I just think we also have to think about those kind of things in addition to, you know, better outcomes. But what evidence am I going to need for the physician to trust the data that I'm giving him? Beyond sort of what I might have had to do with a traditional device. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point you made about some of these new technologies, Laurel, as well. So in addition to, you know, some of the digital technologies, you know, I know a lot of us talk about real world evidence outcomes, things of that nature. So, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that. You know, what are some of the other changes just kind of in general in the field of market access that you guys have all been pushing within your organizations? Why don't we start off with, or I'll let Laurel continue. You want to keep going?
Sure, I'll keep going. I think one of the advantages of digital technologies, at least specifically, is you have a lot of data. So you can collect the type of evidence that you might not have been able to do before. And it's going to be objective because you're seeing the data come across. I will say one thing, there's been a long debate about real world evidence, you know, in terms of credibility for payers. And to channel Evidence Street's Naomi, for those of you who know her, she will say that's fine as long as the methodology is correct. And I think that's sort of the hurdle that we have to think about. It's not just gathering data, but we have to think about all the same things we would have to think about in a randomized controlled trial or another type of trial. And that's around bias and who's included and all those kind of things. So I think, you know, it's something that a lot of people like to talk about. But is it actually something that's being done and resonating with payers yet? I think we're still not there yet. So.
Yeah, if I could, Paul, just jump on that. I think the rapidly expanding capabilities around real world evidence are hopefully coming to a sweet spot with the availability of real world data, right? So everyone's getting better at analyzing data and trying to build the methods to get to the point where we can cleanse it and be comfortable with it. And more data is available all the time. So somewhere there's some sweet spot where we hope that generally there's more confidence. What we focused on in terms of our strategies is real world evidence really can't stand alone. It's really thinking about how our preclinical, our clinical evidence and our clinical experience, and then the real world evidence kind of tie together as kind of a three-legged stool, if you will, and that they're all valuable by themselves. They certainly can all be interesting by themselves, but the value in our evidence strategies now we realize is the value of the whole. So if we have confidence from our preclinical experience and we move into clinicals, both clinical studies and clinical experience through the folks we partner with that use our technologies, that allows us to potentially feel much more confident about the real world evidence we use because it's built on a stronger foundation. And the use of real world evidence, I don't think we've exhausted the potential for the use of real world evidence because we're using it in the R&D process. We're using it now with regulators. We're using it for reimbursement, and we're using it to drive claims for our commercial strategies. But again, by itself, it really requires kind of that long view of our evidence strategies. And again, I would say that that's the other big change is that, as was said earlier, it used to be what do we have to do? What's the minimum we have to do to get to launch? Now we're thinking about evidence strategies 1, 2, 3 years after launch. What other markets do we want to get to? What other claims will we want to have for success? And so evidence, our horizon for our evidence strategies has really been pushed out. And that's been driven internally, of course, but certainly externally by what stakeholders are asking for.
And just quickly, Brian, just to follow up as well. So when you talk about using real world evidence at the R&D stage, how do you do that?
Well, I think there's insights in these large databases, especially when we can do large and retrospective database studies and see how, first of all, for specific clinical areas that we're interested in, we can see different patient populations, and I think that's a critical piece of bringing an innovation to market, is to know which patient are we serving, which patients have the problems that we're seeking to solve with a particular technology. So real world evidence and these large databases that we can get out kind of all the exhaust of the healthcare system, there's insight in there around problems that we could solve, or how technologies, either ours or others, are actually performing in the real world. And those are all insights to be brought into the development and R&D process.
Got it. So, I know some people, we'll talk about RWE and they'll think mainly just about things like using sensors or other data to collect information on patients after discharge and so on, if they're being treated in a hospital. But RWE in your definition then extends to, just real world data from any means, not just things like sensors.
Any data that comes from anything that's not a controlled trial. So, and with all the digital devices that exist, again, the exhaust off that, and that's not my term, somebody else coined that, but is just, it's immense, right? The data that's coming, we're swimming in data. So the challenge again is to feel confident about it and have the methods, as we said earlier, that we actually could feel confident with what we're seeing and what we're learning from it. And getting everybody more confident with how to interpret it, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, thank you. One of our companies also asked a question in the Q&A, because we talk about markets, and a lot of us throw out words like a big enough market, and so the question that was asked was from a company that's specialized in pediatrics that doesn't have the same kind of market size, and so their question was specifically like how do you break through in a world where people are looking for big markets? What are some ways in which innovators can break through that ceiling? So, Amy.
Yeah, I can tell a story about maybe what you shouldn't do. So I had a client working with a pediatric technology, and it was even niche in pediatrics for a cardiac defect. So their solution to the market size problem, to try to get investors to pay for it, was, or to investors to fund it, was to say, well, it all works if we can just charge $80,000 for the device. And then the math is great. And I mean, this was a serious conversation. And I said, well, there are things on the shelf that look really similar to this for adults. And I do think that, and they're about like $3,000. So I think that that might a bit cap what you can charge here. And they were thinking, well, it's, everyone will understand we have to make a return. So, we're going to charge, don't do that. If you have a small market, don't do that. But I do think also don't worry too much about market size, in the sense that if you are a must-have technology somewhere and people will use it, it will find a home. You just have to scale your investment accordingly. So that means maybe you've got to, and pediatrics is a good example where you scramble for every bit of non-dilutive funding that you can find. And figure out how, whether that's through various regulatory means or how you can minimize your cash burn to get it to through development and regulatory or HDE or some other method. And then you have to have sort of like, and where does this go from here? If you're really trying to build a company, not just a product, then you do have to have something behind it that has a larger market. But if you can de-risk it in that initial smaller market, that's okay. It might not be a company. It might just be a tuck-in for somebody, and then it's all about capital efficiency in how you raise money. You don't want it to be like a Sarah Palin bridge to nowhere. We're all old enough to know what that means, but Yeah, that's another mistake people make, is they think, well, this is my first product, but they don't have a portfolio or pipeline, so it's not enough to get you anywhere that will get anyone a return.
Yeah, and Laurel.
I just wanted to add, just if I look at it a little bit differently from the payer's perspective. So when I say, is it a problem big enough? I think you have to look at it from Amy's perspective, but then you also have to think about, if I want a payer to reimburse for this, you have to ask that question through the lens of what they're looking at. Is it a strategic problem for them? Because they too have sort of limited budgets. And so they're going to push back if it's not. And the other issue, and I can give an example, is do they even think it's a problem at all? Because I had a client for a while that has a solution for female urinary incontinence, which is a huge issue for women. If you look at the data, you could say, well, that's a huge problem. That must be a huge a huge market for me. But if you need a third-party payer, what we found with the payers is they don't think they know it's a problem. They just don't think it's their problem. So what we had to do is we had to go back into the data, do all the data analytics to show these clinical pathways where, yes, it's actually costing you a lot of money. It's just not apparent to you. And this is where we can solve that problem for you. But we almost had to define the problem. And that's when I was talking about sort of evidence and ROI, because if you have to go do that, it adds a lot of cost and time to your thing to just convince someone that it is a problem they should care about.
Yeah, and thanks, Laurel. Brian, let me go to you for a second here and go back to kind of, we're talking about people paying for products then. So, when an insurer is looking at value prop for technologies, do they give you feedback? Do they share their views on, on what they consider to be value, or do they keep all that to themselves and just say, we're not going to cover this, or we're not going to pay for it?
Bad answer is it depends, right? So I think Laurel's point is such an important one, and that is whether or not they care. And so we've even experienced that, within our organization, where we've certainly had big, truly innovative, expensive technologies, and we've shown up and they've seen the risk, and they're very eager to have conversations about what the value is and whether or not there's going to be a payment pathway, et cetera. We've also shown up with things that are maybe below that line, as Laurel was describing, and it's either if they don't care, it's not necessarily they don't care. It's just there's only so many things they can think about and focus on. So it really depends on the technology. They're smart people. They have very smart actuarial people working in their organizations, and they quickly start doing math, and they'll have a very quick and down and dirty understanding of the risk that your technology is going to bring to them. And they start there because generally insurers are first insurance companies, right? They're underwriting all the time. No matter what anybody says, when you're sitting with an insurance company, they're underwriting when they're talking to you. And they're trying to balance your technology coming in and how many patients will actually be impacted by it, how often will it be used, and they're doing the math. Whether or not they tell you the math is part of the give and take, and it depends on the clinical space. It depends on the number of patients. And again, I think it was Laurel or Amy, one of them started earlier by saying, time needs to be spent on focusing on the problem you're solving. And I think that is some of the best advice we could give people, is to be really clear about the problem you're trying to solve, how big it is, and whose problem it is, because it's the place it all starts, and being very clear about the patient population you're serving, because those are the questions payers will ask, and you'll know that they care because they'll start to ask about, well, who are the patients that this is aimed for, and they'll quickly be looking for where that population you describe is going to expand, because what they know is everybody's trying to get their technology into the market with the goal of expanding it beyond that initial entry point. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but those are the things that go into whether or not they're real open about the math they're doing, but they're always doing that math. That's the business they're in. Yeah,
that's definitely helpful. Thank you. We talked about expanding markets, going to different markets. I want to talk a little bit about, the international markets for a minute here. So I'll start with you, Dave, on this one, which is, what are some of the significant differences between, thinking about market entry in the US versus, Europe and possibly Asia as well?
Well, first and foremost, of course, irrelevant to our conversation, but there's always regulatory strategies, and certainly with MDR under the CE mark, that's completely upside down. Aside from getting past that hurdle that you can actually market and sell your products into the market, the differences are that every health system is completely different. And as a boutique firm, that's why we maintain 5 offices in Europe. That you have to know that there's no such thing as a European market. That's a collective for political and economic reasons, but certainly not in healthcare. They put CE marking to make it a little more efficient to get the products into those markets, but every country has their own healthcare system, just as the US does. So you have to understand every mechanism that acts on approving, accepting, and paying for your products in each of those systems. And that's the same across Europe, Asia Pacific, and North and South America. So that's first and foremost. You do have some nationalized healthcare systems. They're augmented with certain levels of private insurance. And then you have others such as the US that are more heavily private pay. You have to understand, again, as everybody here in the panel is discussing, what's in it for who, and whether the purchaser is actually going to be the providers, the payers, and what the economic incentive for them, beyond the clinical incentive, what the economic incentive for them is, and each of the technologies that you're trying to promote.
Thanks. Brian, anything you want to add on to that? You're muted, Brian, sorry.
No, I think there's not much to add to that. I think we live those challenges every day. We realize that every market we go to is a little bit different, and some of the challenges of certain markets, I think, for in the future, the questions used to be, you know, how quickly can we get there? And I think if we think about some markets, the question is, will we go there at all at some time, at some point, just if it's so difficult to get there in the future? I think those are some of the questions that may come up in the future. The use of health technology assessment varies around the world, certainly in Europe and in certain markets in Asia Pac, Canada, for example, kind of formalized government-sponsored or quasi-government sponsored assessment of technologies is becoming, I think, more and more of a challenge and maybe an opportunity for some technologies in the medical device space. But and that's something that we're thinking more about in terms of what will that require from an evidence standpoint. But again, it really is, healthcare is ultimately local, and I think we have to have a global strategy with very local tactics from a market access standpoint.
You know, on that note, Paul, look, I was a biz dev guy in most of my roles. And when we were making acquisitions, and it would be the same as a go-to market strategy for an internally developed technology, I would have anywhere from 78 to 120 tabs, depending on how many countries we were launching those products in, or if I was making an acquisition. Well, we looked at the economic model, and every country had to have their own, if we're starting not only the penetration rate, but starting at the pricing, and there's not spillover. They're completely priced based on local market factors. I had a client just recently saying they wanted to launch in Asia Pac just to get some experience, but was worried about pricing it in that market and what would happen in Europe when they went next and then to the US, and there isn't that spillover. It's really local market factors and what the markets will bear in those respective countries.
Yeah, Laurel, you want to chime in? Yes, please.
Yeah, I wasn't going to chime in here, but I actually wanted to now. Just to say, one of the questions too, in terms of global markets, I get from a lot of clients is, you know, I developed a study in Poland, or I did something in Germany. Are the US payers going to accept that data? And I would say they might accept it if you also have US studies, but typically each of the countries wants to see data around their own population. But the other thing I learned too is that some countries follow each other's too. So knowing that if Germany has a health and technology assessment, someone in Poland is likely going to look at that. So understanding sort of those nuances and how people interact with each other and review their data is really important, I think, to understand, and also to know, are the payers in this particular country, whether it's single payer or multiple payers, going to require evidence local, because that's going to make a difference too.
important.
Yeah, those are all great points. And, and again, I was kind of joking before about being jealous, Brian, of, the infrastructure you have, and thinking about, companies like Alira, S2N, access strategies, is this with the kinds of points you're making about all those differences and how all these different markets work, it seems to me that it'd be really difficult for a startup without that kind of infrastructure or access to someone like you to navigate which countries follow each other and all that. Are there resources online for a small company that like somehow break all this down, or do you really have to engage with with someone who's got this kind of knowledge? I see Amy moving her hand. Do you want to take on that, Amy?
Well, I don't know that I have like a resource you can go to specifically to learn all the rules in the different countries. I just think it's all risk benefit of doing something. If your core market, for many investors, if you're a small company, you're raising money, the US market is the crown jewel. It's very unusual, I would say, that a market outside the US is gonna really be a crown jewel unless there's some reason, specific reason. So that being said, why would you go outside? Well, it used to be regulatory driven, that you could get some approval, CE mark faster, and that's still true. But again, now with the key risk being market risk, that CE mark is worth, I would say, less and less in terms of de-risking an investment. I did urge a client recently to start commercializing in Europe, because Germany has had a specific code that actually meant their technology would get paid for under an existing code, whereas, and they had a CE mark. And in terms of, so they had market access from a payment standpoint. And for them, it was so important to show that somebody wanted to use it commercially and was reordering and was continuing to use it. So they didn't hire anybody, and they hired a contractor to help manage the site. So they kept their, no permanent infrastructure over there. They kept their expenses really low. You can never, in that situation, have the expectation you're actually going to make any profit. But they did de-risk things, and one of their key acquirers was Europe-based. So actually having a footprint in Europe and a couple of people were singing the praises of the technology, and even a place where somebody could go and see it in use, because they had that market access in Germany, was incredibly valuable. So when you look at the whole picture, it was well worth it for them to go to de-risk. So I think it's a case by case, and I, increasingly see people say, I'm not even going to try to go outside, but it can help. It can help if you have access. And some of the countries, like there's the NUB process in Germany for new technology. It's like playing the lottery, only less likely that you'll win. But there are programs you can take advantage of outside of the US that are specifically around innovation, if you're lucky.
Thanks, Amy. That's helpful. If anyone else wants to come, of course, you can raise your hand on that topic. All right, so I'm going to move on a little bit. I want to make sure we have some time to get to pricing too in the time that we have left. So I'm going to move on to some of those questions. In a moment. Maybe the last thing that I just want to just clarify from some of the points you just made, Amy. Just for kind of everybody in general, I'm just curious. Is there still advice to is there still a benefit to launch in Europe first and then come back to the US? Is that something anyone is advising people to do, or is it just case by case?
I'll quote Brian. I think it depends. It depends. It really depends. It can help, but it can also induce new risk. The FDA will care if you have problems with your technology outside the US. I am not a regulatory expert, but you do have to weigh, like, what if you do commercialize and something goes wrong? If you have adverse events, complications, like, so it's risk benefit on a case by case in my view.
Great. All right.
I would agree. And then the other point I would say is, I think the point that was made earlier about more markets looking for locally developed evidence for proof of value locally, either as a barrier or as just proof that you have a market specific impact. That's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge, I think, for everybody.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So let's move on to pricing and talk a little bit about that. Dave, I'm going to start with you here. general question that, people always have is like, how do I price something? Do I just look at similar products as a way of estimating my price? What are the essential elements that you consider as part of a pricing strategy?
Yeah, the first thing when I have someone talk to me about cost plus pricing, well, we want to get this margin, hands up, and I walk out the door, say you don't get it, or you really need a lot of help. It's really what's your unique value proposition and how you're going to fit into the market across every constituent and what value you're bringing to them. And look, as someone mentioned earlier, this could be value-based pricing, that you are competitive with a much more amenable pricing than the competitors. We take a holistic approach and start at the end of the complete business strategy and work backwards to what the market will bear and how you're going to determine value. And value to every constituent is different. Some care and some don't, as we were talking about earlier. Something Laurel will certainly get. We spend a lot of time in critical care. If you go to each institution, at least in the US, they look at their critical care units with a different perspective. Some see it as a profit center. Others look at it as a cost center. Some look at it as a necessary department to have if they want to have a large trauma center. They're all viewed differently. So you have to look at, we were talking before about the facilities. If you're going to be at a facility selling, you have to understand what their business strategy and their return on investment requirements are, and do they care about this area? So that's to start. And then pricing comes down to, are you going to generate evidence through health economics and base your product pricing on that factor? Are you going to make it priced on competitive factors? Is it going to be about making something easier or simpler for a clinician to use? And then you have to look at, do the clinicians in today's environment, which Brian can talk to for hours, I am sure, do the clinicians even have say today when you go to, say, the OR and you're down at value analysis committee, or they kick you down to the basement and say, talk to the purchasing folks, where they're the ones who are going to decide which of these products is used. So there's so many different factors that you have to consider. And there's really, again, I think you'll see a lot of the themes here. It depends, but it really comes down to your unique strategy and value proposition at some point in of the process of bringing product to the market. Thanks.
Anyone else want to comment on that, Brian, since you were named there?
Yeah, it's like a debate. I think that point around what's happened in the shift in the influence within the purchasing process, it's probably the biggest change in the industry from when I started a little over 20 years ago. When I started, it was absolutely about coming up with an innovation, getting it in the hands of surgeons. They knew pretty much immediately whether or not it was something they wanted to try, and they would walk down the figurative hall and go to purchasing and say, got to have it, it's the new thing. And we knew that model was going to change over time, and it's changed. And now our user customer more and more is an employee or tightly contracted with our purchasing customer. That is the biggest change, I think, in our environment in the US at least. And that's changed, I think, a lot about how we bring value to hospitals, how we talk differently about our technologies, because there's kind of a combination of things. We need to have a story about price and purchasing and that process, but we also need to be able to make sure that we have evidence and the materials and a way to get information to the value analysis committees that they're going to require to have an impact on those choices. And that's not always easy, because those are not processes that are visible to us. They're generally physician or clinician led, and they're closed processes, and as they should be. So making sure that we're developing evidence and publishing evidence and getting tools and things out there that surgeons who are representing our technologies and value access committees can access is a critical challenge for us. Ultimately, most of the payers in the US, at least, if you look at the way reimbursement has evolved over the past 10 to 15 to 20 years, it's all about pushing the purchasing risk down to the hospital. Hospitals really bear most of the purchasing risk right now. So if it's through global payments or value-based payments, we're essentially saying to the medical delivery system, we're going to pay you in a way that allows you to bear the risk about choosing which things you want to use, which things you want to invest in. So that's, again, more for us to think about in terms of how does our technology help our purchasing customers survive and thrive in what is a very competitive environment. And so again, these are new things, new themes for us. It's not just about showing up with the best clinical product. We have to do that. That's assumed, but it's also how do we delight our non-clinical customers, and that's new kind of end-to-end thinking in terms of the whole package, pricing, value, how does it show up, all the wraparounds around our technologies. It's a more complex business than it used to be.
Yeah, Laurel.
Well, I just wanted to say too that I think in market access, of course, we focus in the beginning on who's the financial stakeholder in terms of evidence, but this also relates to pricing, I think, because who's actually going to be paying for the product. And a good example would be, some of the AI companies that I work with are focused on disease areas, so neurology, pulmonology, something. And so they tend to be working with a specialist. But in reality, the specialist is not going to be paying for the technology. It's going to be the radiologist. So you have to really identify who's actually going to be paying for the product. And then if you want to use sort of a different type of payment arrangement, like a subscription-based service or a per test service, whose budget is that going to come out of? Because if it's capital equipment, that's budgeted differently than a departmental budget that may have to come up with the money to pay for something like this. And you can run into sort of obstacles when it comes to willingness to pay when it's coming out of a specific budget or not. So I just would ask that people think about who's the real financial stakeholder here, who's going to write the check. And if I'm doing an alternative payment mechanism, is that going to change the way I have to approach the hospital?
Yeah, that's such a good point, and it's like this kind of issue I think that people are struggling with now, which is who is the champion, who is the person who's paying, and how do I interact with those, and how does that flow? So is it still like start with the user, the end user, the key opinion leader, whomever, or the nurse or whomever it is that's going to be most impacted, and work with them to kind of become a champion, and then go to the purchasing, or how do we navigate this?
I think that's a strategy. Certainly, you want to have champions within wherever you're selling to, whether you're trying to advocate for coverage with a payer or you're advocating for adoption in the hospital. But not to be cynical, but every doctor I've ever met likes new technology until you ask them to write the check. And so you have to be careful about making sure that you're getting multiple inputs from decision makers. It's not necessarily the C-level, but it's going to be the department head, in addition to the sort of the clinical advocate who can work with you. But decisions sometimes are made outside of their control. For example, if it's a value committee or something like that. So I just think it's a little more complicated, and it depends. To keep
I was going to say, I think that theme carries there. It depends, and I think that's the need to understand that it always starts for us in the surgical space. It has to start with the clinician. It's not an or, it's an and now. So we have to delight the clinical customer. There's no doubt about that. And we have to have a story for our non-clinical customer, and for hospitals, et cetera. What service lines do they care about? Where are they trying to build their business, if you will? What is their marquee area clinically? You need to know those things. So it's not an or, it's really an and for us right now.
Yes.
As we're talking here, Paul, about pricing, we cannot negate the fact that for at least a half dozen years now, the IDNs, you see them talk about it, and every purchaser they're not paying more for Me Too Plus. You can have a nice incremental advancement in the technology, and I even saw this at Medtronic, Covidien, that our R&D, we weren't spending huge dollars. We had to keep up and keep making advancements, but that was a cost to us. That wasn't that we were going to capture any more in pricing by offering a new bell and whistle, though it could be valuable and it could help somebody. If it wasn't, and it doesn't have to be earth-shattering, but it has to be enough of an advancement to capture some type of price, and it has to be a bit game-changing. And we even see this as we monitor the entire marketplace. If you look at even just the regulatory processes, we see so many more de novos going on now. Why? Because we need larger innovations. We need more technologies that are changing the nature of how medicine is delivered, and those are the ones that are getting more value. You look at the exits; they even exit earlier than 510Ks. In PMAs and de novos.
I just thought of something too that, based on your comment, Dave, that I want to bring up because it's so fresh. I'm curious to hear everyone's opinions on this. And hopefully people are watching this, are aware of this too, which is that CMS proposed rule on coverage, immediate coverage for 4 years for breakthrough designation, since you mentioned de novos, Dave. So I'm just kind of curious quickly, how do you see that? How do you see this impacting things? You think we're suddenly going to see everybody applying for breakthrough designation? And what are we going to see? Laura, I saw you shake your head, so I'll start with you.
Well, I know this is something the industry has been advocating for a long time, and I'm thrilled that they put that in the proposed rule. I just think people have to be realistic about breakthrough designation and what it takes to get it. If you look at the history, not that many devices have actually managed to get breakthrough designation. And so I think just working with a good regulatory person to understand, would I qualify for this and what's it going to take, because it's a lot of work to get that designation. So while it's a nice thing, I think, and it's great that we're moving in this direction, I also think that it's not going to be without a lot of sort of factors that people have to consider that they could actually jump on the bandwagon with this. So.
Thanks, Dave. I see your hand.
Great point, Laurel. We had goosebumps when we saw the announcement because it was very exciting, and you championed just the first person I saw on LinkedIn talking about this, Paul. It's very exciting, but we don't want to overplay this because it's not just a reimbursement. You have to go back, as Laurel mentioned, and start with the regulatory. What are the requirements, and how do you get this? It's not going to be a strategy to say, great, now we don't have to worry about reimbursement. We're just going to go breakthrough. You really have to have that requirement for breakthrough designation and understand that regulatory pathway and requirement. And then not only, we just, because we were so bullish on this announcement, we've already had 2 calls with CMS on this, and we're putting together a document to share with your cohort and alumni as well. That's not the end game. Now you have to find the level of reimbursement and the sustaining reimbursement once you do actually get that immediate out the door reimbursement when you do get approved through the breakthrough designation.
Good. Thanks, guys, for that immediate feedback. Yeah, I had kind of the same goosebumps reaction because I do know a lot of companies that have breakthrough and how potentially impactful it is for them. But I was curious if we're going to see this floodgates of everybody trying to be classified that way.
Well,
yeah, Amy.
And just to add, I mean, there have been a lot more companies applying for breakthrough. We haven't seen many go through the whole cycle of also then getting the payment. And it is a bit of a risk-sharing payment. So it's not 100% of what you think you should get that gets covered. They want the hospitals to have some skin in the game too. So that remains to be seen. And we have seen people go all through the process, like drug-coated balloons. It was sort of pre this new breakthrough CMS program, but they got some pass-through payment. There was big adoption in peripheral vascular, and then they got bundled into the codes, into the existing codes. I think they added like $90 or something to the code, and it just fell off a cliff. And it is temporary, even if it's longer, it's temporary. So I just think, it doesn't mean the sky's the limit in terms of pricing. You still have to get hospitals to adopt and use it, use the technology, and then you've got to fight from the day you get it to develop the evidence to convert that temporary pass-through into a meaningful code. And that is no small task. And we don't have a lot of evidence, unless others on the panel who are more in tune with reimbursement and regulatory have seen more than I have, but we don't have a lot of huge evidence of like big success stories of that whole pathway from breakthrough to payment, temporary payment to permanent attractive code. It's still not fully de-risked in my book.
Yeah, Laurel.
I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing too. I just, before everybody gets too excited about this too, to remember this is a Medicare program. And so if you have a patient population that's largely Medicare, then it's, something you might not think about. But if you have a pediatric application, it's not going to apply to you, just because you're focused primarily on Medicaid and the private payers. We had the same thing with remote monitoring. Really, a lot of the commercial payers don't pay for that right now. So we just have to be sure that we're focused on the right patient population for this particular program.
Yeah, we only have 3 minutes left, so I want to cover one other topic before we close, and that's consumer healthcare. We really haven't covered that at all yet, and it'd be remiss for us not to talk about it a little bit. So, consumer healthcare feels like it's on the rise, and that we're seeing lots of companies who are thinking about that space. We're also seeing a lot of companies pivoting back and forth. We're a consumer company now. We're a regulated company now. We're back to consumer. They're just not sure. They're trying to find their footing. So just very quickly on the consumer health side, when we think about pricing, how should a company be thinking about pricing for consumer medical products? The perception is always that consumers don't want to pay for their healthcare. It should be free and just pay a copay. So how do you get people to pay for the value of a consumer healthcare product? Who wants to take on that?
I'll start, but I think I'd like to kick it to Laurel and Amy a little bit. We start off with making a very strict distinction between wellness and healthcare. So I push out, because we are a healthcare organization, we push out anything that's wellness. When we're talking true healthcare, there's absolutely a burgeoning consumer play here. When you talk about pricing, Paul, I mean, that you have to go to almost consumer packaged goods type research and understanding of how people are going to actually pay for this. If you're talking about reimbursed or some types of payers actually subsidizing and paying for components of it, that's a different story. I mean, personally and professionally as an organization, a little bit frustrated that somebody would pay $800 for a Google Watch, but if you said that same watch would tell you your heart rate and help you with your AFib, they're going to question it for another month and probably not make that investment. So, consumers are different. We're so used to, in the US at least, having our healthcare paid for by insurers and have a tough time with that. But they might pay more even if it told them how many steps they were taking on, how fast they're going. So as far as pricing, again, you have to be diligent in understanding who's paying for this. And if it's the consumers, you have to poll them and understand their perspective. Laurel, specializing this, would know much better.
Laurel.
Well, actually, I don't specialize in consumer healthcare, because I do make that distinction as well, that I work with clients that are looking for third-party payment, so a provider or payer. However, I will say that those lines get a little bit blurred with digital therapeutics, because there's a lot of times no way to pay for that wearable. It doesn't fit into DME. It's not going to be in CPT because the physician won't pay for it. But there may be a way to get the physician paid for using that, and get the physician to prescribe it, but the patient is still, in many cases, the one that has to pay for it. And that's a big conundrum in the industry. And groups like Propeller will tell you, it's a good way for direct to consumer to ramp up, get lots of subscribers. But like Dave said, most Americans don't want to pay for healthcare. They'll pay for beauty products, but they're not necessarily think that an insurance company should pay for the healthcare piece of it. So it's a challenge right now for those companies that are kind of caught in between, I would say. So.
Thank you. So I want to close out with just one question for each of you, and have you just kind of go down the line for this. So I'll call on you. But the question really is, common mistakes that you see people making, and or you can go with what are some things that people have done right. So Laurel, you just mentioned Propeller a minute ago. So I'll let each of you, take this on. You can either take on like here's a mistake and how to avoid it, or common mistakes, and here's something that someone's just done incredibly right and we should all look to. So I'm going to start off first with, I'll go with Brian first on this.
So there's many of them. I'll focus on one that's just kind of forefront in my mind right now. It's all about asking and answering questions as you're preparing for entering the market. And one question that I think everybody probably should take the time to ask is, as you bring your technology forward and you think about the solution, who wins and who loses with its application? So the question really is about, if you're bringing something that, for example, changes healthcare so fundamentally that it changes the provider that provides that service, there's going to be a winner because somebody is getting something new and they're probably very excited about it. And there's going to be somebody who's potentially a loser because their specialty or their service that they provide is going to be diminished in some way. That becomes a very important question to understand and it doesn't pop for everybody, but because those kinds of things come to life when you're starting to talk about CPT codes and all the other relationships you have to make other parts of your story develop over time. So that's a good one. Who wins and who loses is a question to spend some time with.
Good advice. Amy.
One word of advice: focus. Don't try to do too many things. Stick to what your goals are. Don't get distracted. March forward. Be capital efficient, and you'll do well. You know, I think also enjoy the journey a bit. I know that sounds very fluffy new age, but I do think that, you know, this is it's going to take longer than you think. That's the only thing I can guarantee everybody. It's going to take longer than you think. It's going to take more money than you think, and you're going to learn a lot along the way. Listen, and focus, I would say, are the two things. And try to enjoy every phase for what it is. And good luck.
All right, Dave.
Yeah, I like this stick to it, but I'd say the wrong approach I've seen are people who have it all figured out from day one and aren't willing to learn and listen. There's millions of people in this industry that have had long experience and many experiences, and you can learn a lot from them. You need to be adaptable. Don't do a 180, but you need to be able to pivot when you have new understanding and new learnings as you build your companies. So those that I've seen that are best are able to be adaptable, and when they need to adjust their business model, and they thought maybe it was, as you were talking, a consumer play, but there are other constituents, or if they need to adapt their technology, whatever angle of it is, it takes every function to succeed in med tech. It's not finance, it's not R&D, it's not clinical, it's not regulatory, it's everyone. So you need to be able to take all of those different inputs and be successful in wherever your greatest fit in that market is.
Thanks, Dave. All right, and then Laurel.
Laurel, I'll just close quickly just to say that I think what we've talked about before is like start early in the process, very beginning, and identify your clinical problem and let that drive your reimbursement strategy. Don't get so caught up in the mechanics of reimbursement like codes and everything else until you really understand how you're adding value to the system and all of the things that go along with it that we've talked about today. And earlier the better, because a lot of this takes time. So.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Laurel. Thank you, Dave, Brian, and Amy. Terrific panel. We covered a lot of topics and we're super efficient at that. So thank you very much. We even had a lot of other questions that were submitted in advance that we didn't get to. So we covered quite a bit and that was terrific. And we'll continue on now in the Q&A, the private Q&A with our companies so they can get to some of those questions. But I want to thank you all as panelists. This is really informative and very topical too, which is exactly what I wanted, very timely for what's, happening out there today in the industry, for people who are on the ground working with a lot of terrific companies, or in the case of J&J are themselves a terrific company in this space, and we really appreciate all of your insights. So thank you all. I want to make sure everyone knows where to reach you. We'll put it into the comments on the YouTube live, as well as obviously provide your contact information with our companies. But very quickly, if people want to reach you, do they reach out to you on LinkedIn? What's your preference for how people should contact you? Start with you, Laurel.
Probably email would be best. Sweeney Laurel S@gmail.com.
All right, Amy. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
With my website, s2nhealth.com.
Okay, Brian.
LinkedIn works, or email bvaughan@its.jnj.com.
And Dave.
LinkedIn is just fine, and my email and full contact information is public on LinkedIn.
Terrific. All right, again, thank you, panelists. That was a great discussion. And for everyone who's watching this on YouTube Live, it's been great having you here. MedTech Innovator, as I mentioned before, has this series going on every week, same time, Thursdays, 10 a.m., 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. You can also go to medtechinnovator.org/live to see all of the archives of past webinars, as well as the upcoming schedule. We've got some great webinars coming up as well. And then finally, you can also subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, and that way you'll get notifications when we go live, so you won't miss any of those videos. We also have a whole series of videos coming up from all the companies in the MedTech Innovator cohort. All of them have produced videos that are really compelling, that tell you more of their story. They're not just pitches, these are actual videos that explain the story behind the companies. So you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get noticed for when those are coming out. We'll also all be at the MedTech conference, which is coming up shortly. It actually, starting next week, are the beginning pieces of content. So if you're not aware of that, you can go to the medtechconference.com to learn more about that. It's great opportunity to really network with people in our industry. So I highly encourage you to do that as well. All the MedTech Innovator companies will be there. You can partner with them using their system. Registration fees are pretty reasonable. So, I highly encourage that as well. And that's where we'll also have the MedTech Innovator Finals this year. So I please encourage you to go check that out. And again, for everyone, have a great day or great evening, wherever you're tuning in from. And for our companies, please stay on. We're going to do the Q&A now and our panelists as well. But for everyone else, have a great day.